So my name is Devi Flix. I'm the country coordinator in the Southeast Energy Agency. Also for the DG Klima, I'm the project manager for this project. And then what is happening in EU over here, if you see that the EU climate law is already established where the target here is by 2030, the EU emission will be cut around 50%, 55%. And that's mean if you're working on the research or energy agency that 30% of government, 30% of the all EU expenditure, it will be go to the climate related project. And by 2050, we need to achieve the climate neutral or net zero over here. So the EU and under the DG Climate, they already have a mission charter objective over here, where actually 150 European region and local authority already signing over here. So now what we are talking about, what is happening in the hood, in the community level. So that's the reason how we don't want actually this initiative only touching government, but not in the community itself or citizen. So that's the reason the DG Klima developed European Climate Park Initiative. So the European Climate Park is a movement of people united by a shared mission to build a more sustainable Europe and to help Europe itself to become climate neutral by 2050. So if you see over here that we have several activity in the climate park, is part of them is actually to become the ambassador or the national ambassador. So what inside the climate park here is actually the activity related with what the learning on the about the climate change, and then we also develop some solution together here, and we trying to influence or to connect it with other, especially in community, through our local ambassador. So over here you see that actually the climate park focus on the climate action itself. Is not only about the government, but it's also touching individual in the group, in community, and how the citizen itself can actually connecting. And what we're doing over here, first, we're raising awareness about the climate change, and we also have informing citizens by the what is actually European Commission policy over here. And this also the activity that we actually develop together with the community itself. So the role in this actually lead by the country coordinator. So each of member state in the 26 European member state has their own one country coordinator, where actually in Ireland is Southeast Energy Agency. So this country coordinator has very unique position where actually to connect the citizen itself to the European Commission. And over here that actually we build a scale like citizen engagement activity, how actually the voice of the citizen can be delivered into the European Commission itself. So we already did this from 2021 until 2023, and now we extend again 2024, and we extend again for next year, 2025. So currently in total in Europe, we have 628 ambassadors over here. And this activity is committed to taking action for the climate and improvement. So we have also, we call it individual pledge, where actually we counting that the count us in, where actually in this platform that you can actually pledge that I commit to do climate action. So that's part actually. And we have also practice tool developed over here. And we have also the citizen dialogue. We have national conference in Ireland or they did in Dublin last month where the DG Klima Pablo come directly. He's the director of the climate park. So he really amazed how actually the climate park activity were growing and bigger and the impact itself in each member state. And we also have youth task force, where actually we connecting with our NGO, connecting with the school. That part is activity that actually we trying to collect together. And we have a knowledge hub that's actually under the Climate Park platform. So me, this one of our ambassador over here. In total, we have 22 ambassador. So in this, it's really range from politician, researcher, and the scholar, and also all of the country sustainability mentor. So all of them actually professional. They're very busy, but they are very committing to do something different in the climate action. So this whole island ambassador, one of I think most of them also join now in our lunch talk today. And that's all from us. So I will introduce our first speaker, Zahra Amirzada. Thank you so much, Zahra, for coming today. He's the international consultant from the UNESCO Liaison Office in Brussels, and her role is actually to coordinate international cooperation and capacity building initiative for several Horizon Europe projects focused on the enhancing climate resilience and community preparedness. So we really very grateful that Zara can speak today and bring all the knowledge and expertise that we can learn together. And also over here that she has collaborated with several academic institutions to develop research and grant proposal and contribute in supporting international organization. So we hope that our collaboration is not only stop here, but in the future, the Climate Pact will contact Zara again for. So I give a floor for Zara to present. Well, I just stop sharing now.
Thank you, Divi. Hello, everyone. I will share my screen now. So, Divi, can you just confirm that I'm in full screen now?
Yes, you're full screen now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thanks again for the introduction, and hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this session. And yes, you already introduced me. So I work in the national science sector at UNESCO, and I'll be talking about mainstreaming nature-based solutions in environmental policy. And I'll be highlighting UNESCO's role, efforts, and contribution in this context. As well, specifically in our team, we have done considerable work on the topic. So to start off, the term nature-based solutions, or NBS, refers to solutions that are, of course, based in nature and importantly, that address societal challenges like climate change, food and water security, or natural hazards, while at the same time providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. They are also recognized by the European Commission as options to address key climate hazards like floods, droughts, heat waves, landslides, and so on, as we can see in the right figure by the European Environmental Agency. And examples of related NBS measures to address these types of hazards include floodplain restoration, sustainable forest management, green buildings like green roofs or green walls, and coastal habitat restoration. So NBS are both directly and indirectly supported by major environmental policy frameworks, such as the Paris Agreement, which is, of course, spearheaded by the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what is particularly relevant in this context is that it promotes the role of ecosystems like forests, oceans, and so on in climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction emphasizes the importance of ecosystems and NBS in reducing the risks of natural hazards and also human-made disasters. The Convention on Biological Diversity and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework underlines NBS as a means to achieve biodiversity goals and also address climate change and sustainable development. And then there is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with its 17 global goals, which also consider NBS as essential tools for achieving sustainable development, notably through SDG 13, which is on climate action, SDG 14 on the sustainable use of marine resources, and SDG 15 on the sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. NBS have multidimensional benefits and therefore can address a range of objectives and societal challenges. On the left, we see an example of NBS that have been applied across Europe, each contributing to different SDGs. Oftentimes, different NBS are also used in combination to address a specific goal. So here on the right, there's an example of various types of interventions that are applied in the urban context to address a range of targets under SDG 11, which is on sustainable cities and communities. In terms of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, which was adopted in 2022 and aims to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, NBS play a key role as well, specifically mentioned in several targets, notably targets 8 and 11. And what is important here is also that efforts have increasingly been made since 2022 to enhance synergies between the biodiversity and climate agendas. So meaning between discussions and processes by the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UNFCCC. And at the same time, that goes as well for synergies between risk reduction and biodiversity protection, which are laid out, as I mentioned, in the Sendai framework and the GBF. Now at EU level, NBS and their related terms, which we see on the right, NBS in the green in the middle, and there are different types of terms around it. So NBS is sort of considered an umbrella term. GI refers to green infrastructure, for example, or ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction in red. So these terms are considered across different policy areas, from disaster risk reduction to climate change to water or urban development. And they play an important role in the research and innovation agenda as well under the Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe frameworks, which we'll see some examples of projects shortly as well. In the left table, which is again from the Environmental Agency from 2021, a report, we see how nature-based solutions and related terms are supported to varying degrees by EU policies. So for NBS in the first column, we see that there is a coverage across the European Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, or the green infrastructure strategy, but we also see certain gaps across other policies. So since that was a review done in 2021, a more recent development that I want to highlight is the EU Nature Restoration Law, which was only adopted this year, and is a key element of the EU biodiversity strategy and sets binding targets to restore degraded ecosystems. And what is very relevant in this context is that the law explicitly recognizes NBS as essential for addressing climate change. So now to talk a little bit about UNESCO's role in this and how it functions as an organization at the global level. The overarching mission of the organization is to contribute to the building of peace, the eradication of poverty, sustainable development, and intercultural dialogue through international cooperation in education, science, culture, and communication and information. UNESCO takes a multidisciplinary approach in generating data and knowledge products, providing advice and policy recommendations for member states through its various programs and networks. And UNESCO has been crucially involved in driving communication between the scientific community and policymakers, and in bridging the gap with citizens by advocating for their involvement in policy discussions and processes across member states. And one way in which that is done is through UNESCO's national commissions, which serve as a central link between government, civil society, and the organization. There are 199 national commissions for UNESCO around the world. Another important platform is provided through UNESCO designated sites, which include the World Heritage Sites, Biosphere Reserves, and UNESCO Global Geoparks. There are over 2,000 sites by now. And these are vital territories where sustainable development is practiced and fostered. And many of these sites, especially natural UNESCO sites, can also serve as climate observatories where climate monitoring, mitigation, adaptation are applied and tested, and where awareness is raised on climate change impacts across communities and local stakeholders. So within UNESCO, NBS is considered and worked on as one of 8 themes within the disaster risk reduction unit, but also across units, which are addressed along these 3 pillars of action: advocacy, knowledge building, and capacity building. In terms of advocacy, a number of reports are regularly published based on surveys, based on analysis and international cooperation and scientific cooperations. To highlight a recent one, the Intergovernmental Hydrologic Program, IHP9, put out its strategic plan on science for a water-secure world in a changing environment, where nature-based solutions are prominently represented. Another important document is the United Nations World Water Development Report, which came out in 2018, a few years ago, on nature-based solutions for water. On knowledge building, UNESCO supported the Operandum project, which is funded under the EU, under the Horizon 2020 call for large-scale demonstrators on NBS for hydrometeorological risk reduction. It was funded between 2018 and 2023, is still active, but was officially completed last year. And this project delivers tools and methods for the demonstration and market uptake of NBS to reduce hydrometeorological risks in predominantly rural and natural European territories. A more recent project is NBS Infra, funded under Horizon Europe, active until 2026. And it is focused on the urban context as opposed to the last one, in particular on promoting NBS to protect crucial urban infrastructure against hazards. And the most recent project only launched this year is Albatros, which is focused on supporting sub-Saharan African countries in adapting to climate change. This is a project that was born out of Operandum, the first project I showed, through knowledge exchange and activities that were organized between European and African scientists and policy makers. So here I'll briefly highlight one of UNESCO's initiatives, which aim to collect and analyze NBS policy. Here shown, and this was done within the Operandum project, and this is sort of the step-by-step approach. And I'll just go through it based on an example here of the Open Air Lab in Italy, which is also a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, the Po Delta Biosphere Reserve, where we look together with partners at an area, Bellocchio Beach, in the Emilia-Romagna coastal area, northeast of Italy, which was affected severely by marine erosion, storm surge, and flooding. And the aim was to build an artificial dune to mitigate these hazards. So together with implementing partners, we analyzed the permitting paths at local level and analyzed the regulatory and policy frameworks that were required to implement this solution. We then conducted a review of relevant policies also at regional, national, and international level. And in this way, we compiled a database, an online database with NBS policies for not only the 7 countries that were involved in the project, but also at a global scale. So by now there are over 100 countries covered. And all of this is available on a digital platform called GeoIKP, which is also still regularly updated. So the policy collection was then validated in consultation with local partners, and subsequently a policy roundtable or policy workshops were organized with stakeholders from local to national level, where the uptake of these solutions and the replication was discussed, in this case across Italy. And finally, the outcomes of this work was summarized in a series of policy briefs. From 7 EU countries were synthesized last year into a scientific article, which we published as a comprehensive review of enabling policies in the EU. And this is my last slide already, so thank you very much for your attention, and I give the floor back to Divi.
Okay, thank you so much, Zahra. It's really interesting. Again, a very interesting project. So hopefully in the future we can collaborate. So if you have some question for Zahra, please kindly just typing your question in the chat, and then we will answer your question later. So after this, we would like to introduce our second speaker, Wouter Vanneuville. I hope I'm correct to say your name, Wouter. And Wouter is working from the European Employment Agency, where actually focus on the water resources and management topic, and his particular specific topic on the EU flood directive from the academic perspective. So after short period back at the Flemish Minister of Mobility and Public Work, he returned to European Employment Agency, and then group on the climate change impact, vulnerability, and adaptation for 8 years. So This is his focus on the national adaptation policy, adaptation reporting, economy of adaptation. So I give a floor for you, Wouter. Please share your screen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm sharing in the meantime, but I'm not 100% sure that is, voila, that looks better. Thank you very much for the introduction and welcome from Copenhagen, where the European Environment Agency is. I'm a little bit outside of my comfort area if you listen to the introduction, because I'm going to focus on health impacts, which is one of the topics we're working on for some years. At least my colleagues are doing on a daily basis. Maybe a very quick introduction who we are. We are a decentralized EU agency, so we're not a part of the Commission, but we are an EU agency. We are a knowledge and a data provider. For example, all the information that countries need to report on adaptation through the governance regulation on the Energy Union and climate change, that first passes by here. And we are not just people sitting in the building that you see at the left in Copenhagen, but we're also a network of national, but also subnational organizations, environment agencies, climate agencies, ministries at national level. And we inform not only the Commission and policymakers, but we also have an outreach obligation towards the general public. And this year we exist for 30 years. Almost forgot about that. More interesting, going to the content, I want to take you back quickly to the EU adaptation strategy, not the first one from 2013, but the second one from 2021 on forging a climate resilient Europe. And if presentations are shared afterwards, which is fine for me, I always have the hyperlinks to the documents themselves, not to have more text than I already have on my slides. And this EU adaptation strategy really talks about we need to go for smarter and for faster and for a more systemic adaptation. And if you look in the smarter adaptation section, it refers to a few products the agency is working on for a long time, one of them being Climate Adapt as a knowledge source, a place where you can find a lot of information, but it was not good enough. And it will never be good enough and always be work in progress. And one of the questions from one of the projects of the EU adaptation strategy was, well, we need to have a European Climate and Health Observatory that is much more detailed than the health information or the sectoral information on health that is now available on Climate Adapt. And there was multiple reasons for that. First of all, there are issues that are happening across borders. There are a lot of hazards involved. There's heat, so temperature-related ones. There's flooding, there's forest fires. So there's a lot of different hazards that can cause health issues. Of course, the one that is not always in that list and absolutely might not be forgotten here is everything which is infectious diseases, allergens, vectors, all these kind of things, and also how they geographically shift due to climate change. And while all these threats are there, and you can say, okay, but we have a health system, and that health system will need to deal with them, there's also a challenge for that public health system due to climate change. And therefore, it was necessary to pool and connect data, to pool and connect tools and expertise. And we didn't do that on our own. We also created a network for that, including a lot of academic partners, including national partners that are specialized on this. And we created the European Climate and Health Observatory. So it's placed physically under Climate Adapt, which helps if you only need to remember one place. And it's very easy to find on the homepage of Climate Adapt how to go to the Health Observatory, which provides a lot of different types of information. Of course, there's policy information. There's information in country profiles about national policies. There's the European policy framework, but there's also much more practical with case studies. And our case studies, we never have the ambition to have as many case studies as possible, because that's anyhow impossible. But what we try to do is to have a limited number of case studies, but also try to follow up over time. Okay, this was in your implementation phase. A few years later, going back to them and asking the outcomes that you had or the output that you had from your project, is that as expected? And a few years later, asking, and the real outcomes and impacts over time of the projects that you were doing, is that really as expected? Were some new things coming up that you didn't think about? Were some things not reached? Some new things reached that you never envisaged before? So there's a series of case studies, indicators, because indicators often help to understand how things are evolving geographically or over time. A resource catalog, which is just a lot of external documentation, but also map viewers, an overview of warning systems for health and tools that are existing at national level, and some observatory publications. And that's what I will focus a bit on for the rest. I have no idea what happened now, but it's not what I was hoping for. Voilà, this is much better.
Okay.
I hope you can still see my slides. I suddenly got a pop-up screen that I didn't really want. One of the other activities that we're doing is working together with Europe's insurance industry to look at total economic losses from different weather and climate-related extremes. And if you look at the different circles, in Europe, in the EU 27 in this case, the biggest group of events are floods. Floods are responsible for over 40% of the total losses. However, if you're looking at the insured economic losses, it's everything which is storms that becomes the biggest group, because in general, storms are much more linked to people's mandatory insurances in Europe than other types. So there's already a shift, but then comes the biggest shift. And that's when you're looking at fatalities. And fatalities just as, of course, the most extreme part, but also, yeah, roughly the only one where there is a kind of number that is trustworthy, much more than people affected or people becoming ill and so on, is fatalities. And there you see that more than 95% of the fatalities we have in Europe are due to heat waves. Of course, we still have flood events with fatalities. There were storms with fatalities over the last more than 40 years. That data series is long, but the main one is heat waves. And it's not every summer. There are really a few peaks. And looking at what the weather outside was, what were the temperatures, what were the daily maxima, what were the weekly maxima, and so on. And then also looking at the fatalities gives you also an indication if some measures were taken, if those were helping. For example, it's more than 20 years ago, but the summer of 2003 had really a lot of fatalities in Europe, more than any other summer in the last 40 years. But that's not the summer with most heat waves or with the highest temperatures. No, afterwards, after 2003, some of the measures that were taken had their effect. For example, just to take a single country, in France, there were mandatory measures about what to do with elderly people if temperatures reach certain thresholds. So these kinds of things have their effect. It's not only looking outside at the weather and the climatological variables, it's also looking at our effects. So there is a clear health impact, which is of course much broader. It's also all kinds of injured people. It's not just the physical things, it's also the psychological things. Having your house flood is not a pleasant experience. But if you look at the number that is counted the most consistently, the fatalities, don't forget that heat waves are the main one in there. When the Climate and Health Observatory was created, its first main activity was having a joint effort with the Lancet Countdown, which is an authoritative voice when it comes to health but which also wants to be an authoritative voice when it comes to health and climate change. And that collaboration is still there, as the Lancet Countdown Europe is part of the network. And in 2021, it was clear that all EU member states have adaptation policies in place, being it strategies or plans, being it at national level or at regional level, but that there were issues about the implementation of the actions that were in there. So the implementation was really lagging behind and could be supported by more knowledge on what are effective solutions, what are efficient solutions, and a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work in certain conditions. And then, of course, that heat extremes were already leading to increased numbers of fatalities and negative health effects. And a growing urban population, an older population, and all these things are, of course, factors that are not really helping us automatically. And of course, at the second part, those infectious diseases I already talked about in the beginning, that large areas of Europe, or increasingly large areas of Europe, are much more suitable for those than they were in the past, including not the least ones like dengue fever, Vibrio infections, or the West Nile fever. That was the first one, which is, okay, there are health risks of climate change, and we're going to respond to them. I come back to the titles throughout the presentation, because it's relevant to look at how our knowledge is shifting. In 2022, there was then that huge focus on heat and the diseases, with unprecedented heat waves that are the greatest, the largest direct climate threat to Europe's population. Also, because a few years ago, a few years before, we did a study about heat waves, noise, and air quality, and geographically how often those regions are overlapping. And it started from the numbers that I showed in the beginning, but also from the fact that there's a lot of information that is now mapped already in countries' plans on climate change, but at the other hand, also looking at in countries' health plans, in national and regional health plans, how much is known there and how much is said there about climate change, because of course it's working in both directions, and it needs both sectors or thematic approaches to work together to be the most effective and efficient. For the rest, it was a very clear call to move from planning into action. It's clear that there's always lack of some kind of detail, but that is not stopping from knowing what can be done already now and which actions can be taken. So that was certainly one part. And a second one was also to increase the awareness. And okay, of course, the general public needs to be aware of this, but especially of healthcare practitioners. And that closely links, of course, to the fact that health is a very prominent sector in all countries' adaptation reporting and climate adaptation reporting, that how much is climate really an issue already in the healthcare sector amongst healthcare practitioners. So we made the move into, okay, what are the impacts on health? And the last step was done this year, just a few months ago. Okay, Kurt, we know what is out there, so let's now focus on responding to these impacts on human health. And this time, the focus was more on floods and droughts and on water quality, so the more water-related ones, with a critical need for the implementation of the existing EU legislation. There's a lot already available, but it's the implementation of not only health policies, climate policies, but also the water policies that need to be implemented further, but also in an integrated way, not next to each other like three silos, but in an integrated way. And then the existing solutions can be rolled out across multiple sectors, I mean, in this case, it's of course very clear that water management as a sector and a health sector need to be working together very closely. But it's really a cross-sectoral efforts that will be needed to protect lives, prevent adverse outcomes, but also to increase people's well-being. When you think about drought, when you think about what quality that is lowering, I mean, it's not immediately in itself that drought is causing a lot of fatalities, because luckily, in most cases, drinking water and prioritizing drinking water is really on top of the list. But if there's so little water in your streams, if your lake temperatures are increasing and therefore you have a decreasing water quality, that's not what you want on the moment that you also have a Mediterranean summer like we have recently. So it's not just from, we can still guarantee that there is drinking water of sufficient quality. There's also a well-being aspect related to that. And then, of course, its responses are needed in all those sectors and in all directions. Spatial planning is then, of course, a much more long-term looking one. Building design, how to deal with insurance about these things, because you can now decide that during a certain summer where you have droughts and decreased water quality, what can I do immediately? But long-term solutions will come from spatial planning. How do I deal with heat waves that are the most important ones for fatalities in Europe? How do I bring down my temperature? So it's all of those working together, but we always try to focus on them by selecting a few of the hazards and to keep it a reasonably short document for policymakers, but also mainly for experts in those different fields to go through. I think this was the last one. Thanks a lot. Of course, the Climate and Health Observatory has its direct link, but if you don't know how to find it, go via Climate Adapt, which is in any browser easy to find. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Wouter. So we will for sure will have a lot of questions to you. And then meanwhile, if some other participant want to have question, please writing in the chat. So I give a floor now to Chris. Dr. Chris Phillips is a researcher in the MaREI Center in the University College of Cork and currently working on the Horizon Europe funded project called MAGICA. So we aim to advance climate action through European research and innovation. So Chris research primarily deal with the climate adaptation, mental health impact of climate change, resilience and risk perception in Ireland. So he has very contributed in the significant project, especially in MaREI and funded project Translate and the EPA funded Climate Island. So I give a floor for Chris to share your screen and to do presentation.
Just give me 1 second there.
Yeah, no problem. You can see actually your slide now full.
Yeah, I'm having some trouble with PowerPoint and Zoom. Second. Things are just not overlapping for me. Okay, so you can see my slides there now, I think.
Yeah, but it's not full screen. If you can make it full screen.
That's not full screen.
Yeah.
That full screen there?
Now it's full screen.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction. I'm really happy to talk about what our work is in Climate Ireland. So I'm a postdoc researcher in MaREI and UCC. I've worked on a couple of projects. I'm working on MaGICA at the moment, which is a Horizon Europe project, which mostly looks at integrating science and climate science into policy across Europe. So we kind of run ECHA, a lot of those conferences to bring scientists and policymakers together. I've also worked on Climate Ireland, which I'm talking about today, which is pretty much the central hub for climate information in Ireland. And also I worked on the Translate project, which is a MaREI funded project that's to standardize projections of different climate variables such as temperature, rainfall for Ireland, and create climate services for Ireland. So pretty much just a quick introduction for Climate Ireland. So it's funded by EPA, and like I said, it's a central adaptation hub for climate information in Ireland. And it was developed by the MaREI team a couple of years ago. I think it was around 2020, 2021. And this largely came from a place of, it was an action in the climate action plan for Ireland that there needed to be a central research hub or a central information hub. And MaREI pretty much was tasked with the development of this. And its key tasks were to support building organizational capacity. So pretty much in local authorities mostly, and across the Carrows, building capacity and supporting risk assessment and risk management for climate change in local authorities. Also to support the development of climate action plans within local authorities. Also to train local authority staff as well, inform the adaptation community, and just raise awareness around climate change. So it was pretty big remit for tasks that we were supposed to do. The couple of things I'm going to talk about today really are, I suppose, the three main things that came out of Climate Ireland, which would be how we created a semi-quantitative risk assessment methodology, which was employed by a lot of local authorities in making their climate action plans. Also, how we assessed risk assessment practices in the financial and commercial sectors, and that fed into the National Climate Change Risk Assessment methodology, which is published recently. And also how we developed the Raising Awareness training course for local authorities. So these three things pretty much came from policy, and I'm going to try to link them to best practice as best as I can. In the way that we developed it from an approach looking at international best practice and looking at the scientific literature, developing our models and our programs, working collaboratively with different organizations and local authorities, and then rolling out different iterations of our programs and refining them over time to inform best practice in those areas. So first of all is the semi-quantitative risk assessment. So we developed a couple of versions of this, and really it was to help the local authorities assess their risk and do it on a semi-quantitative basis. So instead of a qualitative basis saying, here, these buildings are at risk, we actually look into quantifying risk for certain assets. We took this as a collaborative approach with local authorities and the Carrows and different stakeholders, such as Geological Survey Ireland and the OPW. But we started off with our review of best practices, pretty much looking at the IPCC assessments, the 5th assessment, 6th assessment, as well as things like the EU taxonomy, just different types of risk practices that are out there and the international best practice methodologies. And then once we looked at all of them and then created a report and a review, we brought it back to the Carrows and back to the local authorities and seeing if it was fit for purpose and if it actually worked for them, instead of this is what we want you to do and it might not work for you. We actually sat down with them and developed it together. So that was our version 1 of our methodology. We picked a couple of case studies to look at, and these would be heat-related risk for road surfaces, as well as fluvial flooding of social housing and fluvial flooding of heritage assets. Some of these case studies we didn't have data for at the time, but we kind of did like a mock-up of how you would run through the semi-quantitative risk assessment, how you would apply it until that data was available. So now we're working with people like the Transport Infrastructure Ireland to start working on these data sets and working on indicators that we can feed into the semi-quantitative assessments. Pardon me, sorry. Once we had this kind of first draft, I suppose, of our methodology, we brought it back to the local authorities for pilot workshop, which we done with Donegal, Sligo and Galway. This helped to refine our methodologies, see where it didn't suit the local authorities, for example. And then based on that stakeholder feedback, we developed our version 2, and then I suppose disseminated our methodology and the guidance materials and how to run it. So an example of how it works would look like this. So if this is just say heat, for example, on roads, it just kind of, you take in the data and you do your assessment on which roads meet the certain risk factors. So at the time we didn't have the data for these roads, so we just kind of showed what it would look like. Certain roads might have, if you bring in data for what the road is made out of, what's around the road, just say buildings and how heat is captured by those buildings, that'll heat the road up a bit more, as opposed to maybe roads that are covered by trees or out in fields that might be a bit cooler. So you take in all of that data and then you perform your risk assessment. So moving on then to what we've done in the finance sector. A similar process where we looked at the international best practices. So this was pretty much to look at how the financial commercial sectors conduct their climate risk assessment. The reason we picked these two sectors is because they already fall under a lot of strict reporting guidelines. So you have the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Disclosures. I'm terrible with acronyms, and there's so many of them in climate change. And then there's the CSRD as well. So these are kind of reporting frameworks that a lot of companies have to, of certain size, have to report their climate risks or climate disclosures under. So we looked at all of the policies across Europe, regulations on reporting for climate change risk. We looked at best practices in companies, the data that they use, any models that they use. We brought this together on a report which shows all the approaches, criteria, and data that different companies, organizations employ for their risk assessments, how they disclose their climate risk, what policies or frameworks that they work under. So if they're using the EU taxonomy, if they're using the TCFD, or if they're using CSRD, what are the main ones they're working on? And then we started to reach out to companies and organizations across Ireland and the UK. And I don't have the number for the amount of organizations that we actually contacted, but 11 companies responded with interest to talk to us. So they nominated some people that were working in sustainability and risk management. So these are people from the high up management all the way down to people working on risk assessments and doing data analysis. And we conducted 20 interviews with participants that worked in different ECSG roles. We contacted people that worked in commercial sector, finance sector, consultancy, climate services sector. So this could be like people in MaREI, for example, or people in banks like AIB. And we reached out and we talked to them about how they assess risk. And this was pretty much to feed into the methodology on a national climate risk assessment, which has been published recently. So this would feed into that so that we can learn lessons on how other sectors can start reporting and disclosing their risks. Some of the key lessons that we learned were they're looking for enhanced data accessibility. So sometimes, especially if some of these companies are working across Europe, they're saying that where the data should be openly accessible, a lot of the times it's not, or the data is held by a private company, or different departments and sectors are working kind of siloed, working as silos, and they can't access those data. So we hear that quite a lot. Also, a lot of the data might not be in user-friendly formats. This is a problem that we had in the Translate project, where a lot of data was in a file format that wasn't accessible by majority of local authorities or even people that work in a private industry. So our approach, our task in that project was to make the data more accessible. So instead of having them in netcdf files, which are like a climate change format, we were having them we would change them into more accessible GIS formats like shape files and stuff like that. So, or even try to get the data into Excel format so that they can use it. Also, standardized risk assessment approaches. So there's no real guidance out there on how these companies can assess their risk. There are certain standards, but nobody's telling them that they should use certain climate scenarios or use certain types of data. So this is starting to come along in Ireland now. With Climate Ireland starting to put out some advice and guidance on this, with Translate putting out their standardized data sets. So it's starting to get there, and working on this project really helped a lot of those companies because now they're aware that some of that guidance is there, but there's no real standardized guidance for them to use. A lot of it is just suggestions. We suggest you use whatever RCPs or whatever climate scenarios, but there's no like real standardization. Also collaboration. So there a lot of people we interviewed were calling for more collaboration and trying to break down some of those silos. I know that's difficult for many reasons, but that they're encouraging the knowledge sharing and more communication. And I suppose the biggest lesson that came out of this was a lot of these companies are afraid of the government imposing more legislation and more regulation. So they're afraid of that because there's already a lot of regulation out there and there's a lot of reporting that they have to do already. But what they really want is technical guidance and support on reporting to what's already there and abiding by legislation that's already in place, such as the CSRD. So they're looking for more guidance on that and more guidance on what scenarios to select and how they can become more resilient as well. So that report is out now, I think. Then the National Climate Risk Assessment methodology has come out, and this is fed into that. So lastly, we also developed a raising awareness training course. So this was a course that it came from a climate action plan. So there was an action in the plan that was calling for training for local authority staff. And recently is a mandate that went out to increase this training, which the EPA has pretty much taken over now. So they're developing their own training for local authorities. But originally, MaREI was the one that developed this training course in collaboration with the CAROs and with the local authority training group as well. So this was hosted on Climate Ireland's e-learning platform. It was an online course, and about 15,000 participants have completed this course since it started. The idea was pretty much just to raise awareness about climate change, but also to build capacity. We also had a building capacity training course. It was rolled out by I can't remember what that acronym stands for, but it was rolled out by the local authority training group, and they pretty much helped us to identify who needs to complete this course, and then we facilitated the training then as well. It was built around 3 different modules, which are the climate science, the physical science, action, policy, so how the science is integrated into policy, as well as the different climate actions that are taken up by or completed by local authorities. And we had lots of different examples of climate action that was happening in the country. From here, we've taken pretty much this database of participants and respondents, and we started to develop a best practice paper around this, which is in draft form. It's going to be published, I'd say, soon. And the focus on this is to learn lessons over the last couple of years that we've ran this course. I think we started running it in 2021. So to learn lessons and insights that can inform best practice and future iterations of training courses across Ireland. So when we started this course, we pretty much looked across all of Europe, looked at different training that was offered in other countries in Europe, the UK especially, and what kind of platforms and e-learning platforms they had. We learned lessons from that, and we developed a report around it. and then started developing our training course and implementing it on the e-learning platform. And then we also had in-person workshops, so we could work collaboratively with CAROs and with local authorities to I suppose make better iterations of the course and improve it. And now that's kind of moved away from us now, and the EPA have taken over that course. But we're now looking at how can we learn lessons to improve future courses and create these best practice documents that other people can start implementing in training. So is that it? Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So really, I suppose the point that I want to make is just how we develop these things from the policy actions. So we took the policy actions, and then we began looking at the international best practice, distilled that down into what we need to develop, looking at data sets, looking at the needs of local authorities, then working collaboratively with those groups and with national organizations, and then creating the course, and then through workshops and through participation and further collaboration, refining what we have, and then putting out our final product and any best practice guidelines after that. So yeah, that's everything. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. This very interesting presentation. So we have limited time, so I just try to combine all the question for all the speaker here. So this will be comment. There's a question actually about from Yaiza actually, how the social part is considered implemented in your methodology. And the second question from us is, what is the biggest challenge when you introduce this methodology, for example, NBS for the European member state or your collaboration stakeholder for the EEA, that how you actually reach your vulnerable target group and introduce that to what is the challenge when you're reaching them. And for Chris itself is actually for your local authority, what is the main challenge that actually that you introduce your methodology on the risk management here, this actually climate island methodology? What is actually the challenge that you face when you're actually facing? So I give a floor for each of you, from Zahra, from Wouter, from Chris, whoever you want to answer the question.
I can answer on the inclusion or how the social issues are addressed in nature-based solutions project. That was the question, right?
Yeah.
All right. So just from the EU projects that I introduced, I would well, I didn't have much time to go into detail, but these solutions that were actually deployed and tested at these rural territories, they were all based on the co-creation concept. So that means that from the initial design stage to the final implementation and monitoring phases, communities and citizens were very strongly involved and consulted regularly. So the NBS, they were considered really as place-based solutions that require the involvement of local communities to ensure that the outcomes are actually effective and successful. And so, for example, when it comes to maintenance of these solutions, or of course also to drive awareness and replication. So these types of approaches are also embedded in the European Union's research and innovation agenda, right? So many of these calls under Horizon Europe framework explicitly call for projects that are based on participatory approaches and citizen science. So in these projects, we, for example, develop multi-stakeholder engagement strategies, which define not only, of course, the key stakeholders in each territory, but also their needs and how these needs can be met and how to keep people basically engaged and motivated. And another thing I would just quickly highlight in the context of UNESCO's work through UNESCO designated sites is that these sites apply integrated solutions collaboratively. And in many cases, traditional and local knowledge play a very important role and really build a foundation of climate adaptation solutions. So in the case of nature-based solutions, we know that this is not a new concept, but in many parts of the world has been applied for many generations. So kind of leveraging multiple knowledge streams has proven very important. So these are just some examples of how kind of social issues like social cohesion or social inclusion can be addressed.
Okay, thank you, sir. From Wouter, can you address this question? And then I also interesting if how you can actually target your vulnerable group over here?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that probably has a lot of different aspects. The first that came to my mind, and I will stick to that, is that the whole concept of just and just resilience is getting more and more attention, which means that what you're not trying to do is to make a solution where you say, well, this seems the best solution and it then needs to work for everybody. But then you look at, okay, what are the needs of different vulnerable groups, and can I do things that are targeted for them? And even people who say that, for example, the political agenda for the next commission is very industry focused and so on, there's a separate chapter on that just resilience and how to decrease people's vulnerability of different groups and increasing their resilience. So I think that is probably one of the key concepts that is going from the international level at the UNFCCC, where it's having its own negotiations up to the way people look on the moment that things are implemented further. One of the, and then I stop immediately. One of the issues, of course, is that the whole health sector is organized very differently nationally and regionally, which also means that it doesn't make a lot of sense to give the same kind of solutions for Spain and Finland, for Iceland and Turkey, or whatever. So also there, very local context taking into account any knowledge that is already there. Where I come from, we love to have our big windows on the south to have light inside. Well, if you go to the Mediterranean, they already realize that that's not what you want. So you can learn from that, but mainly also use local knowledge. There's a lot more, but that's for another session, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for the last, Chris, what do you think that can you implement the social part on your methodology, and what is the main challenge for you when you actually introduce your methodology to the local authority?
Yes, we have many challenges for introducing these methodologies. I suppose the big ones are capacity of the local authorities to actually do the work. So a lot of times the local authorities want to do the work, but it's very difficult to implement the methodologies or to work on them. Another big one would be access to data or availability to data. So sometimes if we want to look at the climate impacts of certain assets, the data just isn't there. So on particular roads or something like that. So flooding on roads, for example, the data might not be there. Or the causes for degradation of certain roads, that data might not actually be there or not accessible to us, because it could be sometimes we look at certain assets and the data is controlled by a third party and we can't get access to it for, certain commercial rights reasons. Another problem then really is, I suppose there's a lot of red tape around that as well, around what data we can use. So we come up against these hurdles sometimes, but I suppose the biggest one is the capacity for local authorities to do the work. So we hit that hurdle quite often. It's not their fault. Sometimes it's a funding issue, or sometimes it's the people just aren't there to do the work. And the last point I wanted to make was sometimes training as well, which we've tried to address that, climate training, but in some cases, the people that are working on this in local authorities might not have, just say, the GIS training that they need or the data analysis training. So that can cause a couple of hurdles as well. But we try to work with local authorities to overcome these issues as much as possible. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, thank you for the speaker. It's really great presentation. Really appreciating that. And then as for the wrap up, actually, we would like to say that the Climate Pact is continuing to 2025, and we will have this kind of series of the lunch talk where we actually invite the speaker. And for the nearest activity, we have some activity in Galway where actually the Climate Pact also will be present over there. So again, thank you for Zahra, for Wouter, and for Chris for presenting here, share your knowledge, and then I can say have a good day for everybody, and then have nice summer holiday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See you.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Thank you.